with you. As John said, I previously led some of the work around the Gatsby pilot in the Northeast and played a role in the national rollout with that. And since that role, I've moved on to lead careers provision across Academy's Enterprise Trust. John, if you just move on. Academy's Enterprise Trust, for those who don't know, is one of the largest multi-academy trusts in England. That means I have responsibility for careers provision across 32 primary schools, 21 secondary schools, 5 special needs schools. We have 100 apprentices across our group, and that equates to around 30,000 learners and over 5,000 staff. If you just move on again, John. And the whole vision and mission of our trust at AET is to inspire each and every student to choose a remarkable life. And indeed, the motto of every one of our academies is find your remarkable. And for us, that's not just words, that really is at the center of what we try to do, which means that careers is incredibly important in all of the schools that we oversee. And just move on there, John. Now, our structure, as I said, I lead on careers across the group, but every school has a careers leader, and that careers leader is responsibility for the design, delivery, and impact of the careers program in their school. It would be crazy, I think, for me to write a central program at the center of a mat and be detached from the local context of every school. Our first guiding principle is that schools know their students, their area, their economy, their partnerships best. The value of a MAT, just like the value of any network, is being able to bring career leaders together, and that's something that we do. And one of the things we did when we brought our career leaders together was to ask them to co-write our trust-wide careers strategy. And if you just move on, John. And of course, I think in the current times, as Rachel alluded to, there's kind of 3 practical questions that I think are facing all of our schools. And the first one is, how do we navigate the challenges of COVID-19 and what solutions can we develop? Now, you might not be able to read that too clearly, but when you get sent the slides, you'll see. And this is just a kind of a virtual post-it note activity that we did at our last network meeting. And what I suppose I would say here is that for every challenge that every careers leader identified, somebody was able to identify a potential solution. And in my head, I think the challenge currently is pre-March, we existed in a physical world and we knew what we were doing with careers in that physical world. Then post-April, we entered a virtual world. We didn't really know what we were doing, but we learned, we got quite good at it. And we knew how to operate in that virtual world. But since September, we're operating in a strange hybrid world where students are physically back in classrooms, but with more restrictions than we've maybe ever had before. And of course, some students have to be sent home, and therefore we have to be instantly ready to offer virtual learning. And sometimes that virtual learning has to take place alongside the physical learning that you're delivering. So a number of practical challenges to navigate. And just move on, John. And I guess the second question is, how do we integrate careers into our recovery planning? So it's just some things to think about on the slide there. How are we planning to ensure that any careers content that was postponed and not reshaped for virtual delivery last year, how are we addressing that this year? How have we modified the intent of our programs in light of COVID-19? Why have we planned our program to be structured and sequenced and delivered in the way that we have this year? And why is that best for students? And what are our contingency plans for those different modes of delivery that we might need? And if you just move on, John. And the final very, very practical kind of concern I think that we all have at the minute is we are inundated with email offers. So which ones do we choose and which ones do we put to one side? If you just move on, John. The answer I think that we're trying to develop across AET is to focus on, well, what is it we're ultimately trying to achieve? What are our intended outcomes for careers? If the Gatsby benchmarks are world-class inputs, then what are the outputs we want to see? And ultimately, what are the outcomes we want to achieve? So across our trust, we've created our Remarkable Futures Strategic Objectives Overview document, a summary really of the intended learning outcomes that we want to see through our careers programs and provision across all of our schools. Those outcomes have been created with consideration of the Gatsby benchmarks, using the CDI framework and the PSHE frameworks, and to Rachel's earlier point, we took part in those CEC Benchmark 1 webinars, and they really helped to shape our thinking. They were tremendous. And what we're hoping that this does, and what we're seeing it do, is it's bringing a level of trust-wide consistency and a level of clarity, and it's making sure that our careers programs are progressive and that the content is determined by the intended outcome. If you just move on, John. So just to give you a little look at what that document looks like, and hopefully you'll recognize that we've created this with everything that Rachel was saying in mind. So you can see there on the first page of the document, which starts with the trust-wide vision and mission, details the AET value. Move on, John. And then what we do is we've identified intended learning outcomes. So we've broken those down into 3 overarching concepts of what we want students to be able to know and do and have learned by the end of each key stage. And we've roughly said that by the end of key stage 3, the theme there, the concept, is career exploration. So there's a series of things that we want students to be able to know and be able to do by the end of key stage 3, and they're broadly determined by exploration. In key stage 4, it's broadly determined by experiences, and in key stage 5, broadly determined by career management. Now, of course, the focus on exploration, encounters or experiences, and management skills is present in all of the key stages. They're not mutually exclusive. However, having some broad themes like exploration merely gives us a chance to highlight what we want to emphasize in each key stage. Just move on, John. And what we've done is for each of those intended outcomes, we've divided them across 7 progressive themes so that you can see how what should be achieved by the end of key stage 3 is built upon in key stage 4 and built upon in key stage 5. And those themes are employers, workplaces, LMI, progression pathways, the curriculum, destinations, and careers information, advice, and support. If you just move on, John. And to Rachel's point and the template that the CEC provide, we've integrated that essentially into our strategic document. So what we do is, whilst we have intended outcomes by the end of key stage at trust level, we ask every individual school to map those into what are the intended outcomes for the end of each year group in your school, and then to link those to key events in the careers program. So to achieve this intended outcome, what are the activities and provisions that you're putting in place? And this just helps to make sure that our careers programs are progressive and that the content is constructed based on the achievement of those outcomes, so that it is hopefully progressive and impactful. Just move on there, John. And then crucially, and Rachel alluded to this, careers we don't want to be seen as an optional extra or something that's important but sits outside the main business of the school or the main priority of the school, particularly in these times when time is especially tight in schools. And so we ask that career leaders link their intended outcomes to the whole school intent statement, particularly the statement around curriculum intent, and that careers objectives are devised in such a way that they help the schools achieve their KPIs and their whole school objectives as well. So integrating careers learning into the success measures of a school. We'll just move on there, John. And then just finally, just at the end of our document, and you can see this is now one strategic document that houses lots of key information. We just make sure that we publish a link to the careers program. So each school inserts a link to their careers program, and then they just provide additional information on those individuals and documents that support the delivery of careers provision. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we want to ensure that the outcomes drive the content of the careers program and the delivery mechanisms, and that there's lots of support geared to help achieve those outcomes. Next slide, John. And I asked one of our schools just to share with us some top tips really on doing this. And what they said is their first top tip was, don't take the easy route. The very easy thing would be to identify some intended outcomes and just layer them straight on top of what you're doing already. It's important to think independently about what you want your students to achieve and to be able to do, and by when. And then be open-minded about that, and be willing in some places to add new provision that will help you achieve this outcome, amend your current provision, or perhaps even remove an activity because it may not necessarily be needed anymore. And in that sense, in these tough times, there may be the opportunity to do less but achieve more. The analogy of kind of throwing darts at a dartboard, you can hit 180 in 3 darts, or you can hit 160 in 10 darts. So just be really kind of focused on what it is you're wanting to achieve. And of course, use your intended outcomes to identify and plug any gaps, and then obviously address those gaps. And think about careers as a journey. So whether that's a 5-year journey through year 7 to 11, a 2-year journey in sixth form, or a 7-year journey, think about it in that context and use the outcomes to explain why you work with certain partners, why you deliver certain activities, and why you do them at certain times of the year in the way that you do them. Next slide, John. And there's a couple of things that really underpin this approach as well. And the first is making sure you get the balance of your inputs right. So auditing your provision against the Gatsby benchmarks, and crucially, knowing why you've arrived at the decision you've arrived at. So making evidence-based decisions against all of the criteria of the Gatsby benchmarks. Next slide, John. And then translating those into an action plan. And my tip on the action plan really is to show in that action plan how you'll maintain your strengths as well as address any areas for development. And that's certainly something that Ofsted do ask for. How will you maintain the things you're good at whilst addressing the things that need to be improved? The next slide, John. And we obviously, all of our career leaders are now or about to be using Compass Plus to track what's going on in careers. Next slide, John. And all of our career leaders have completed career leader training, either the free online training or some of the bursary training as well. And as I said, we've taken part in the Benchmark 1 webinars and are getting involved in the Benchmark 4 webinars with the CEC as well. Next slide, John. Really important, of course, to Rachel's point, to monitor the progress that you're making. And it's much easier to do that when you have a set of input measures, the Gatsby benchmarks, and you have a set of intended outcomes. And it's at that point you can start to discuss progress. And I've put on this slide all of the things we do to monitor and track progress across AET in terms of careers. I think the point I'd make here is we get leaders to hold people to account. So whether it's our trust CEO and executive team holding head teachers to account, or whether it's governors holding career leaders to account. And on the point of governance, careers is now a standing agenda item on every academy governing board meeting. Next slide, John. And just if you're thinking, well, I'm not in a mat, and so this kind of approach doesn't really apply to me. I think what I'd say is it's very easy for you to determine what are the intended outcomes of your program. I said I drew on Gatsby, I drew on PSHE, and I drew on the CDI. And then, of course, just like our schools, each of our schools really are responsible for delivering their careers program and provision in a way that best suits them. And I've given examples of how different schools approach careers across our trust. So it's just having that strategic focus on what we want to achieve and then designing everything else in relation to that. Next slide, John. And just to recap on something Rachel said, what do we know about Ofsted? Well, we know that careers is included as part of personal development, and it sits within that judgment. Interestingly, destinations is included as part of the judgment of quality of education. And we know that Ofsted look at two pieces of information really before they arrive at a school. They only really have two pieces of information. And they are contained in the IDSR, or certainly one of them is. Destination data is included in the IDSR. And of course that data is lagged, but it will, Ofsted will infer some things from your destination data. They'll also then have looked at your website, and in particular the careers section of your website. They'll have looked at your program, and they might start to join those two things up to form some initial questions or to form an initial impression. So I would say understand the narrative that the published data is telling you about destinations, understand what's on your website, and be willing to address that with Ofsted. Of course, Ofsted define progress as children knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. I think it's useful to remember that in the context of the design of our careers programs. And of course, Ofsted are looking for students to be able to connect new knowledge with existing knowledge. And that's why it's really important that our careers programs are sequenced to be next slide, John. And so we've heard about the 3 I's. If you look at those through the lens of careers, it's what are the aims of the careers program, including the knowledge and skills to be gained at each key stage. The implementation is how are you translating those aims into a delivery structure and narrative that is appropriate in your context, showing what is to be delivered in each year group. And then the impact of the provision needs to be articulated, and that should be visible both in the students and in their destinations. Next slide. And I think the 3 I's essentially could be the 3 C's. So content, what are the endpoints that we're looking to achieve? And what do children need to be able to know and do? And why is that important in your context, in your school? Then concepts, to get to these endpoints, what concepts do children need to learn, understand, and demonstrate? And then the final one is sequence, but of course that doesn't begin with a C, that begins with an S. So I went with calendar. So essentially, what is the sequence and order that children need to learn these concepts in to add knowledge in the right way and to help them connect different pieces of learning together? Next slide, John. And so I'll leave you then really with some key considerations, and that is, do you know the strengths and areas for development in your careers provision? Will Ofsted be able to see the implementation of your planned program? So will they see the program that's published on your website enacted in reality? Is it coherent, age appropriate? Is it appropriate to the needs of your students? Does it show progression? And do the experiences you provide build upon one another? How do you quality assure? And of course, these are questions that governors can ask the careers leader, or the career leader can report to governors. How do you track, monitor, and evaluate? And how do you know whether successful outcomes have been achieved and what that positive impact looks like? And is that ultimately reflected in your destination data? And then, of course, when we talk to students, will they speak confidently about the choices they've made, how they've been prepared for the next stage and their future plans? And do you know the aspirations of your students? And what steps have you been able to put in place to support them to develop and action those aspirations? And then last slide, John. And for me, I think leadership is key in all of this, and that's why the careers leader certainly plays that role of, as Sir John Holman would describe, the conductor of the orchestra, having to bring everything together so that it's coherent for each and every student. So hopefully you can see in that very kind of whistle-stop tour of what we've done, our attempt to try and build a process strategically that helps us focus on our outcomes and how that needs to drive the content of the provision that we offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.